My name's Danny Block. I'm a geographer at Chicago State University, which is a predominantly African-American school on the far south side of Chicago. I grew up in Chicago. My dad was a criminologist, a sociology professor at Loyola University. And I don't know, I kind of want to, some people get into geography because they just like maps, and I think that was my initial reason for deciding that I initially wanted to be a cartographer when I was about 6. I went to Montessori preschool where you were able to kind of go around and explore different stations in the nursery school. And one of them was a map area that had all these map puzzles, and I would work on it. And I memorized the provinces of Australia, I remember, and worked a lot on the United States, and I just loved this stuff. And I throughout my time growing up, I would draw these sort of fantasy maps or real maps of real spaces, and I also just sort of stare at atlases. I'd go to sleep reading the Rand McNally Atlas and wondering about the places that I saw. I actually wonder sometimes whether that, because I liked really creating places back then, whether I might have enjoyed being a city planner. I went working with city planners, but when I was in high school, I took mechanical drawing, and because I wanted to be a cartographer. I knew I'd have to do drafting. And so then I thought, all right, I'll maybe be a cartographer, but then I felt after a while I was sure that, I don't know, that there really weren't too many cartographers out there. And I thought, the chances of me getting a job in cartography are really small. So I decided, all right, I'll be a civil engineer. And my mom sat down and said to me, Danny, you've always wanted to be a cartographer. Why don't you go to schools that have cartography programs? And so she sort of convinced me that it was possible to be a cartographer, that the competition was not so high, that I actually could do it. So I decided to not go to engineering school and actually go to schools that had geography programs or cartography programs. So I wound up at MACALASTER, college here in St. Paul, because it's one of the few small liberal arts schools that has a cartography or a geography major, as well as a geology major, which I also really loved. And I wound up double majoring in geology and geography, and then trying to figure out kind of how to bond them together. Because the geology I was really interested in back then was it was not the kinds that it was what we call hard rock geology, or I like studying earthquakes and going out and figuring out how mountain chains formed and that sort of thing. And but the geography I was studying was sort of urban planning stuff, so it wasn't physical geography. So I took a lot of history classes too. So I was trying to figure out how to bond all these together. And in my my last semester, my senior year, I took a geography course on soil conservation in Africa. And I decided that soils, and initially I thought I'd study Africa, but soils is a place where human interaction with the earth was was sort of most obvious. So I wound up going to the University of Illinois for my master's in geography with the intention of studying soil conservation and I worked with a professor there named Tom Bassett, who was one of the first proponents and still is a strong proponent of something called political ecology, which back then there was maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 articles on. This was 1989. And now there's many, many more. And I was going to study in, where he studied in Burkina Faso, or somewhere in West Africa, and probably look at sort of Sahelian soil conservation issues or something. So I went there, I took French, I was about to start taking African languages, and it was all going to focus on Africa. And then I realized that I couldn't get to Africa to do my master's thesis, and I wanted to do a field work for my master's thesis. So I figured out a study on the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a government, still exists. It's a USDA run program where farmers set aside highly erodible farmland or farmland that's wetlands. In my case, it was highly erodible. And they plant, I was working in the Great Plains, so they plant native grasses on it, the idea of bringing it back to being, to a more natural state. And they're paid a certain amount per acre for like 10 years to do this. There's a 10-year contract. So I worked out this study in northern Nebraska, in kind of the Sandhills area of Nebraska. So I wound up going out to Nebraska and living on a farm ranch, and studying soil conservation there. And what really, I really liked doing that work. What really hit me also was the kind of incredulous nature of the comments I would get from both my fellow grad students and my friends in Chicago, which was kind of like, you're a geographer, you could go anywhere. You were going to go to Africa. Why are you going to Nebraska? And yet I really enjoyed it out there. But I started to think more and more about the agricultural policies rather than just the soil conservation issues. I didn't want to get totally away from the soil conservation issues, but the U.S. ag policy issues started really to fascinate me, which led me to going to UCLA and working with Margaret Fitzsimmons, who's a geographer who studies U.S. ag policies, no longer at UCLA, but and that led me to studying milk and sort of the history of milk production and regulation. I also became really interested in relationships between urban and rural, urban consumers and rural producers. So I wound up doing my dissertation on what I think of as kind of the rise of the modern food system seen through milk, but focusing really on where the milk marketing order program came from and other current dairy regulations. But looking at that through the development of Midwestern cooperatives in the area that served Chicago, and how they related to the distributors in Chicago and the public health community in Chicago that was really promoting milk production, or milk consumption, sorry. People like Jane Addams and other Chicagoans. So I did that, and then went off to Oklahoma for a couple of years and taught there, and then got a job back in Chicago at a community-oriented university, Chicago State. And when I came back to Chicago, I decided I really wanted to go out and use my skills in cartography, which along the line I kept on being a cartographer, with some of my with my focus on food issues. And that's what led me to what I've been doing recently over the last 10 years or so, studying food access issues, specifically looking at supermarkets and supermarket access kinds of things. But really doing that in a collaborative way, often with community organizations, and sort of being focused not only around research, but really assisting community organizations with using this research to do planning and action in their communities. It's also led me to a lot of collaboration with folks in public health at other universities or in Chicago State too, and other disciplines too, sociology, anthropology, and I through that I'm teaching right now a class in public health in Northwestern. So I've been doing all this different kinds of stuff, and now I still teach in geography, and I also lead something called the Neighborhood Assistance Center at Chicago State that partners with neighborhood organizations to do community-based research. So I've got a sort of, I don't know, it's pretty fun kind of job where I get to teach and I get to be out working with community groups and not just do research actually, but just be parts of committees, or I facilitate an urban agriculture, the neighborhood urban agriculture sort of collaboration, which is really just I bring in a speaker every month, and the folks in the community who do urban agriculture come and talk to each other and listen to the speaker who might be able to give them some resources. So it's fun. We do all sorts of different stuff. I feel kind of crazy because I never know what I'm working on in a day, but it's a lot of fun.
I guess because I know something about the MACALASTER context, I kind of want to start there.
Sure.
Because I know that specifically in geography, and geography and political science, MACALASTER was a very rich environment. And I'm wondering a bit about the kinds of ideas and people you ran into there that have been important later on, especially in geography, where I know there were some very substantial folks working.
Well, I had an odd geography experience at MACALASTER actually, because I spent my freshman year in Holland, which is obviously not MACALASTER, but my dad had a Fulbright Award, and I wound up going over there. I wrote the University of Utrecht, where we were living, and asked if I could go to school there for a year. And MACALASTER, I talked to MACALASTER, I'd already gotten into MACALASTER, and they said, go and we'll accept the credit. So I did that. And I wound up taking, there you just take your major. So I took 8 geography courses. Now, one of the things that's great about MACALASTER is that they actually have a maximum number of courses you could take at a major. So I came with 8 courses in my major. So I wound up only taking 3 geography courses. But I took like 5 or 6 history courses, and I took a whole geology major. So it really, what really influenced me at Mac was a couple of things. I mean, certainly that soil conservation course that was taught by a visiting professor from England really influenced me. David Lanegren, who was the chair of geography, I took a course on sort of the historical geography of this Twin Cities. And I think that course, where we studied the St. Anthony Park neighborhood in depth, the course kind of showed to me how history, which I had been taking a lot of history and a lot of geology, which I always saw as sort of being the same thing. You just use different records, you know, you're using the rocks, or you're using archival records, but you're sort of piecing together stories. And geography, before that class with Lanegren, to me, it was kind of more about cartography and the modern world. So I think that actually really influenced me, because I even though I'm not doing historical work now, that's sort of the way my mind thinks. I love doing historical work, and I love piecing together stories. So even my current work, I'm really trying to figure out ways to look at, you know, change over time. So that class, now looking way back at it, I think was actually pretty influential, because it kind of talked about, or we were studying popular history as seen in a community. So that was quite influential. But actually, the classes I took in history, many of whom were with Peter Ratcliffe. He was like I don't know if he's still there, actually. He's a great guy, and you know, was this labor activist and historian, and when I was there, was working a lot with the meat packers in Austin, the Hormel strike related stuff that I think had just ended when I came. But I took a couple of African American history classes with him. Class on, I think, the Great Migration. Another sort of working class history course on the 19th century. And then I took a course with the Rosenbergs. I can't remember Norman, and that was on kind of 20th century popular society, which was great. And that stuff also really affected me, because really what I did for my dissertation was very social history kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But in reality, I wound up spending 40 hours a week in the geology lab. So to me, it did probably to people outside, it might have seemed odd that I was this kind of science major, but I was taking all these other human, history classes. But to me, it all came together. As I said, it's just about telling stories, and that those stories, well, at least in the history sense, and in that geography sense from the St. Anthony Park class, those stories could kind of be told from the lives of everyday people and everyday objects. So I did a great, this is off your subject, but a great seminar, a sort of young faculty, new faculty seminar at the Newberry Library in Chicago a few years ago on popular cartography. And it was great. We spent the summer just looking at these old maps of the Newberry Library. It's a wonderful place. But I wound up writing a paper on maps of Iowa, official maps of Iowa, state maps of Iowa, and looking at the imagery on them, and how I was specifically focused on sort of urban and rural images, and how they were these amazing maps. Actually, it was like on the flip side, they talk all about Iowa in these glowing terms and how it had this modern cities and these modern farms and these modern roads to connect them, and I mean, so, and it was a lot of fun to do that, and we wound up with Jim Ackerman, who's the historical cartographer there at the Newberry. We wound up then looking at 6 different states, including Minnesota, and doing the same kind of thing, looking at the imagery at the back. But, you know, the idea that things like that, you know, maps, and really not the map part, but the back of the map, could be a historical thing of historical research, I think really came out of those classes, I guess, those MAC classes. So,
yeah. You're addressing the kind of map I like best, which is the ones in various social studies texts where there are little ears of corn and windmills and sheep sort of scattered over a not terribly detailed map.
Yeah.
I've always thought those were deeply wonderful, and I've never, when it gets more detailed than that, now with Google Earth, you don't need a map. You have the Earth at a smaller scale. You can just go look, you know.
Yeah, you know, I'm really sad about like it's hard to get just your regular fold-up paper map where you can lay down on the floor and look at the whole area. I was lost, or well, not lost, but I couldn't find a place I was going, an urban farm in Chicago the other day, and I stopped at a gas station. Like, they don't have maps anymore. It was so sad. At least this one didn't. But they did know where I had to go. So I feel like I need to get a what do you call it? An iPhone or something, just so I can have a map. But I don't really like looking at those little pieces of the world. I want to look at, you know, how things connect, and it's sad. But anyway,
well, I mean, I'm curious as to how maps figure into what you're working on now. I mean, which is a combination of understanding food access issues and also activism. But I'm understanding that cartography has come back to be very relevant to what you're doing, and I'm wondering how that is.
Well, it's always been pretty relevant, although in my dissertation it is very historical, and I did do some maps, but I lost the cartography. Well, I didn't lose it, I just was using it to get myself through grad school on the side. But now, yeah, it's very relevant. You know, when I came to Chicago, just a couple months after I came, the Community Food Security Coalition had its annual meeting in Chicago, and I went and I found some activists who were trying to start some sort of food policy council. So I went to the meeting of the council, and they talked about the need for a map showing food access, or where the supermarkets were and that sort of thing, which I was amazed was not already around. But over time I realized why, because there wasn't very good data out there. But I wound up creating, getting a grant and then doing a couple different kinds of food mapping. One that was very in depth in a smaller area, not too small, but an area about 115,000 on the west side of Chicago. We did partner with a community organization to do market basket studies, where you make a list of all like 102 foods, go out and see what's in these stores, every store in the community. So we looked at every store, which was kind of a neat thing. There's a lot of these kinds of studies, just look at larger stores. so that was a really fun and insightful community-oriented study. And out of that, we created maps. And those maps one of them wound up being in a city report which compared a lot of neighborhoods for food access. And that the maps really both communicate the idea, and this was right, the idea of food deserts wasn't really around in much of the time, but that the maps kind of communicated that idea. And then when we went and did a mapping of the entire 6-county region, and we sort of focused on areas, we did things like show distance to the nearest large store, and then put the a crosshatch of the African American communities of Chicago and the suburbs on there. The correlation, that you could just see on the map, really told the story really quickly, and people just get it. Now that it shouldn't imply that one thing is causing the other and that's the only thing out there, but the map is so communicative that even though we do statistics after that and such to sort of prove these connections, that map is really kind of the most important thing that brings people in. And then we also worked in specific communities and did community maps of those on food access. And those sort of help with community planning. So, and we do maps actually that are not food related. If a community group just calls up, we can do a map of their community for a grant or whatever they're working on. But I believe really, and I love to write on this, but that not just the maps that we've done, but the idea of food access issues, of food deserts that popularly called, but I don't really love the term. I think why this has come up so much now, and not only that, but things like health disparities and such, is because mapping of these kinds of things has become, in a sense, easier to do. Like you can create maps with a Geographic Information System, a GIS, of these kinds of sort of showing distributions of things like this fairly easily, and because of that, not just professors like me, but consultants and activist groups have been making these kinds of maps. And sometimes they may be pretty simplistic, but they tell this story of, look, there is amazing disparity in food access between here and here. And there's amazing disparity in terms of life expectancy between here and here. And look at all these things, they all correlate. Crime correlates, the income correlates, all of this. And, people in public health have known this for a while, but the maps, the way they're communicating it, may not have been in a way that was as easily understandable as the maps that we are now using so much. So I kind of believe that this focus on food deserts and actually health disparities may have something to do with the rise of geographic information systems, technologies, and that sort of thing as a communication device. So I really think, I use it all the time in my work, but also maps and mapping are incredible communication devices. The mapping process is an incredible way of getting community people involved and going out and mapping their neighborhoods. It's really a strong thing. So I don't know. It's very important.
It sounds very important. Now, there's of course would be an easy way of doing maps, as long as you're working with census data and then I expect that there are programs now that just feed the census data into a map and give you whatever you want, right?
There is, but like, you know, 20 years ago, that would have been, even that small thing, you know, would have been hard to do, because you would have, I mean, maybe 25 years ago, you would have been doing a lot of that in pen and ink, or you know, taking, you know, maybe you have a base layer of your census tracts of Minneapolis or something, but then you'd be, you know, using different hatches and stickers and such to like put on top of to show the differences between communities. And now you can, you know, just join a Excel file with a whole bunch of data on it to a file, a geographic file showing the census tracts, and just look at one and look at the other and make this map and that map, and it's just much quicker to do, and since and allows you also to look at these sort of correlations between various layers in an easy and quick way that you couldn't do before. So it's sort of like you can discover things in the data.
So am I understanding right that with regard to food issues, one of the things that drives the projects of going out and gathering data is the fact that there is a technology that makes it possible to turn this data into something that's obviously useful.
Yeah, exactly. You know, people go like, oh, we want a map. We want something like that in that other neighborhood, and yeah, it is. Now, the maps are only the first part, and I always say, like, you know, I can show you a map of a whole bunch of points, you know, supermarkets and such, but it doesn't. That's just what I would call the food access landscape. It doesn't tell you how people actually behave and act in the communities that are shown as food deserts versus other communities. So I think it is very important to have other forms of data to completely tell the story. But mapping is really a powerful tool.
Let's focus for a minute on this food desert business. Can you can you just explain what a food desert is and how?
Well, first of all, I don't like the term.
Okay.
But I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I don't like it because when we look at most communities, it's not like there is no food. You know, there's food. It just may be expensive or just in small corner stores that don't have a good variety of fresh produce or other kinds of healthy items. So it's I don't know, I don't really like the term, but the term is sort of what's people kind of think about it. So food desert, I guess what I define it as an area with a low concentration of large or medium-sized grocery stores, and low concentration sort of in relationship to its to the mobility of the residents and also to the population density. So basically, if you look at urban areas, you might compare areas of the same population density, and if one you have to go a lot further to get to the nearest store, and other you don't, and the one where you have to go a lot further may be a food desert. But there also can be rural food deserts, often because of a combination of low population density and sometimes correlate at least with areas of fairly low income. So in that case, it may be a situation like that a county might have no grocery store related, you know, because the store that was in the county seat is closed down, and people now have to go 30, 40, 50 miles to the nearest store. That may be okay in certain cases. Maybe if you have fairly good mobility, that might be okay. But if you're an elderly person, or if you don't have the use of a car, that's a real issue. And that's true in the city too, things like that. So it combines this concentration issue, where it often kind of starts out at, with other access sources of issues in terms of income and mobility and all sorts of things. But generally on the maps, because the maps show points which are supermarkets, the focus is on distance to nearest store, or just like areas in which there is a very low concentration of supermarkets.
As you've studied this food access issue in the communities where you've been working, what has come to seem to you important? I mean, you mentioned that a map just of distances can be misleading, and I know that in my own experience. We live in a neighborhood that got burned out, and so there isn't much. But it doesn't entirely matter, because there's something with good, cheap produce and pretty much what I need. 10 minutes driving distance, and I can drive. And I don't think it's a problem for most of my neighbors on my block, but go 2 blocks down, it becomes a very big problem. So there's this issue of the relationship of nearness and mobility. I'm wondering what other, what you've seen as the issues that matter with regard to this.
So, I mean, this is where the, say, qualitative work comes in, interviews and that sort of thing. I think there's 2 ways in which this matters. And one is in sort of an individual health kind of way. If you look at particular people who have difficulty getting, accessing food to feed their families. And that difficulty may just be a time thing, the sort of investment of time in terms of getting to the various stores that can be very far away, to get the kinds of, to get their market baskets to buy the food they need. And there is, a lot of times the food access issue is sort of focused on a health, or individual health kind of explanation, in which if it's difficult for people to get to stores in which things like fresh produce are available, that is one reason why people may not be eating as much fresh produce, and they may be eating at what is there, which is often fast food. It's not, that's kind of the stereotypical story, I guess, is it is fast food, but there are grocery stores. But that's, I think that story is at least one story that we hear from people. The other thing, though, we really hear, and I think this is maybe just as important, is that people feel disrespected by their food landscape. Meaning that they look out and they see the kinds of stores, or the lack of stores in their communities. They go to other communities, they see abundance, and they wonder why they are getting the sort of bottom of the barrel. And I think they see it often, or they communicate with us about this through talking about food, but there's just, I think in general, issues of access, issues of the look of the business districts that are in their communities, the fact that there's a lot of empty lots. These kinds of landscape issues, I think, are a lot of times the way that people experience difference and, in many cases, racism within their communities. There's also just interpersonal relations issues that when they go into stores, the stores that are there, they often feel like they're not very well treated. So, in a sense, you know, I think oftentimes, I mean, there's sort of the relationship between food access and health that is sort of often focused on. But in a sense, I think that one of the reasons why food deserts and the food desert maps are so powerful and have been on, you know, when some of these were, not my maps, when some maps were released, they were on the front page of the Tribune and, you know, and got really people talking, was about what they revealed in terms of difference and racism in Chicago. And that was actually true for, you know, I have people from wealthy communities coming up and saying, I can't imagine not, you know, that there's areas that don't have grocery stores, you know, and so it's true on that side too, but it's also, you know, most intensely felt by the people living in the communities who experience this both as a hardship, both as a difficulty in getting food, but also in a way of defining their communities and how they're treated in our society.
Well, you're touching on one of what I think to be one of the great mysteries of the universe, which is why certain things look so bad. Mm-hmm. I mean, the place where I ran into it first was not with regard to food with places, but with regard to something within places, that is the pictures on frozen food. And you look at the low-end pictures, the pictures on low-end frozen food, mm-hmm. and I swear it looks like vomit. I mean, the food pictures are not food. I wouldn't feed it to my dog. And I keep staring at these things and thinking, what happened here? Did somebody say, I'll bet that people in this area, socioeconomic group, would really find this picture attractive. Mm-hmm. And they set it up to look like that, and they're just that inept? Or did somebody say, I want there to be a reason for people to buy higher. Mm-hmm. So the low end has to look low. Mm-hmm. Same reason you don't give benefits to adjunct faculty. You want there to be a horror for the regular faculty to avoid falling into, so they raise themselves up. But, and then I go into grocery stores, even grocery stores with magnificent produce selection, basically. And I look at the difference between the ones in wealthy areas and the ones in poor areas, and there's a kind of pervasive grunge. And I don't know quite how to define that, but it doesn't seem that it would cost that much to clean it up. But it isn't cleaned up. And then you go down a level to the discount places, and it becomes, you know, a level worse. But rich people's discount places don't look like that. You know, I mean, it's like you put out food in boxes at Aldi, and it looks quite good. You put out food in boxes at Snow Foods or something, it looks very different. And I'm just trying to understand, and I don't know if you have any light on this. I mean, is it a matter of folks not having the resources or defining themselves with respect to the community, or why is it that so many food places in poor communities feel oppressive from the moment you walk in?
You know, I know that the people who we interviewed who from poor communities talk about those kinds of things, and it's not just other people who've studied why people choose to shop at particular stores talk about things like smell and lighting and such, almost more than price. Now, the flip side of this is, I mean, there are ways in which there are markers that discount stores use to sort of indicate that they're a discount store, like the boxes. And there's ways that a store like Aldi, which in Chicago was generally thought of as sort of the bottom, I guess, where I got in an argument with somebody once because I had put an Aldi on a map, and people, somebody said, "That's not a grocery store," you know, and get it off the map. I was like, well, actually, they do sell groceries. But they have been changing the way they show things, and they've been moving into higher end neighborhoods. So in those stores, the new ones are actually quite nice, and they're sort of cleaning it up, which is and that those kinds of markers, in a way, like even the way that the sign looks on the side, or the you know, whether when you come in the floor is sort of concrete and gray or tiled and white, you know, these kinds of things are markers to how people should perceive that store. I think, though, they are, in that case, because all these one in which, at least in Chicago, stores in various neighborhoods still look really different. I think it is somewhat sort of investment based on what kind of, based on the community. So I think, you know, stores in wealthier communities do tend to get the food, the grocery store, and supermarket companies do put more money into the aesthetics of that experience. In terms of the actual food, the packaging and such, I think it's a really, I'd never really thought about what he said. I think it's like my own dorm room. I thought it was a really interesting point. I don't, the place I've interacted with that more at most is on organic milk cartons and comparing those to non-organic milk cartons. And, you know, the organic ones have this sort of statements about the farmers and these sort of long, you know, discussions of happy cows, and the non-organic tends to just be milk, and there's very, you know, little else in terms of labeling. And I don't know. I think in that case it's kind of a trying to justify the high price that you're paying for the organic. But why the low-end milk is just standard, and really, I think probably goes back to the whole creation of standardized milk grades and when people stop buying from particular farmers and just buying Dean's or the store brand or whatever back in the 40s and 50s. Some of that happened later, in which the whole point was to create, to almost go away from connecting with individual farmers and create something that was standardized, which was clean, that all you need to know was that it was, whole milk or skim milk and grade A, and that's all you need to know. And I think that was sort of what food, the history of the development of foods back in that period was sort of going towards. That we could have clean, standardized food that you didn't really need a label or a fancy label, because the whole idea was that it was cheap, safe, and at least somewhat wholesome. And I would think that's where the idea is that you didn't really need to do too much to promote your canned green beans or frozen green beans, other than, stick a green giant on it, if it was to show that maybe it is that it's a brand name, a little higher. I think maybe that's where it comes from, but I've never really, I've thought about food labeling a little, but never too much. But it is true, especially when people go into supermarkets. These aesthetic things are totally what people comment on. Even, there's this distinct Whole Foods smell, that when you go into Whole Foods. So I think those things are really, really focused on. One final story on this. I don't remember where this was, but we were way back in the beginning of this. We were talking to some consumers in the Austin neighborhood of the West Side. The first study we did, and one of these commented that General Mills was making all of their cereals whole grain, and they put this in sort of big letters on the cereals. And this person commented they had stopped eating General Mills cereals because it says whole grain on there, and that wasn't the kind of food that they would eat, because they didn't think whole grains would taste very good, and it wasn't for them. And we mentioned this to somebody at General Mills, and they were like, "Oh, this is an African American neighborhood on the West Side," and they had never thought of that a group of people, or at least maybe this was just a few people we interviewed, but would have such a negative feeling about the fact that it said whole grains that they'd search out other options that didn't say whole grains on them. So aesthetic and packaging could really help define who we are and aren't, and what we eat and don't.
Well, let me try out a theory applied to packaging and see if it applies to stores too. If I am running a range of food, I've got a big line, and maybe I even own several brands, under. What I do want a brand that hits poor people, because I don't lose that market.
Yeah.
And factually, the stuff in the poor people's package is not going to differ a ton from the stuff in the rich people's package. Yeah. If it's roast beef, it's roast beef. I don't want my poor people's stuff to compete with my rich people's stuff. I don't want my rich people to go slumming.
Yeah.
I want them to buy the high-end stuff, and I want them to turn up their nose at the low-end stuff. I want the poor people to say, I wish I could afford the high-end stuff, but I can't. So until I make a little money, I'm going to buy the low-end stuff. Now, with packaging, that makes a great, I can understand how you get this range of packaging, and I also can understand how if you go into a store that only has the low-end stuff, you're going to feel like people are telling you over and over again that you're an inferior sort of person. Because every package is designed to not really compete for your attention. Because it's designed to be in a store in which there's a range of stuff, and you want people to buy high, because your margin's at high. I mean, this is a theory, and I'm wondering if it's a theory. I don't know if it applies to packaging of food. I'm guessing it does. I'm wondering if it applies to stores too, you know?
I think it somewhat does, but I think store food buying is very complex. So when we talk to people who would go to Aldi for their canned goods, go to a store, another store for meat, like a small store that's sort of focused on meat, go to another store for produce, a lot of it was kind of price-based, but a lot they were thinking about quality too. And were very wise shoppers. So they were people who would have figured out that the canned beans didn't vary very much. And I think that they, and maybe even high-end shoppers might can figure that out. Also, when they go into a store of a certain type, and it's not just that you go into Whole Foods and you feel that, you smell that smell and you kind of think, oh, I'm in this upper end store. If you're looking for a discount store, you also go in and look for those markers too, So it's not just that you're aspiring to the Whole Foods model. There's, folks who are looking for the discount stores too. Now there's a lot of people who don't like shopping in them at all, but there were people we ran into, both people from poorer neighborhoods and some wealthier neighborhoods who really sought out stores like Aldi. And when we were doing these interviews, Aldi was really thought of as kind of, at least in Chicago, as sort of this low-end store. They have, as I said, sort of tried to change. Probably when they noticed there were people in upper-end neighborhoods who were coming in. So I guess that's where I respond as to your theory, is that they are creating stores of different types and different price points. So Kroger, for instance, has Food for Less as their discount brand. I know they may have an upper end brand too, I'm not sure. Food for Less, you go into Food for Less, it's sort of more warehouse looking, it's got boxes, you box your own food. I've always wondered how much that, really saves on labor versus just being part of the shopping experience that tells you that you're saving money because you're boxing your food. That actually could be just as important as any labor saved by not having food baggers. So I think it's kind of a complex thing. I think you're right that companies do create brands at different price points, and grocery companies create brands at different price points too. But it's not just that everybody's aspiring to to move up. It's also people are using those different stores for different reasons. Another thing we saw is that the sort of mainstream grocery stores, people would use, because what they do have, even though a little more expensive, so those are the Albertsons and in Chicago, Jewel and Dominic's, they use them because they carry everything. So, they sort of, typical family might shop at Aldi for canned goods, go to Sam's Club once a month, and then after they shop at Aldi, they might go to Jewel to sort of fill in the things they couldn't get at Aldi. So they're actually, and I mean, that takes a lot of time, and that might be somebody who's fairly focused on the cheapest and best ways of doing this, but they use these stores at different levels for different things, and because they need to sort of know what level they're at, all these aesthetic things come in terms of communicating that. So what level they're at, what kind of store they're at. So I guess that's what I'd say. So it's not just the low end for poor people, the high end for wealthier people. It's people actually at both ends of income scales using markers, and those would be the smell of the store, the brightness of the store, the parking, and the brands that are there, to sort of reconvince them that they're in a store of a certain type at a certain price point and where they can get certain things. And okay, so
Sure.
And to do that in a food desert area, to do all of that work, to go here and here and here and here, is a lot of work. So that's where it actually really affects a particular person.